The wagon had been rolling for 6 days when the axle finally gave, and Hannah Vogel stood in the middle of the road watching the wheel lean sideways like a drunk man about to fall. The driver spat into the dust and told her plain that this was as far as his kindness went. She had paid him through to Elkhorn Bend, and Elkhorn Bend was a mile back around the bluff, and if she wanted her trunk carried the rest of the way, she could carry it herself. He tipped his hat the way men tip hats when they mean the opposite of respect, and by the time she had blinked the grit from her eyes, he was already turning the goodwill back toward town. She stood in the July heat with $2 in her pocket, a letter that was no longer worth the paper it was written on, and a trunk she could not lift alone. The letter had promised a position as a schoolmistress in Elkhorn Bend, Colorado Territory, at the wage of $12 a month with room and board included. The letter had also been written by a man who had, according to the postmaster she'd finally reached that morning, been buried in the churchyard 3 weeks before Hannah left St. Louis. She had traveled 900 miles to teach for a dead man. She sat down on the trunk because there was nothing else to sit on, and she did not cry, because crying was a thing she had used up somewhere around Kansas. She was 29 years old, unmarried, and the daughter of a Prussian baker who had died owing more money than he had ever counted in his life. She had been raised on rye bread, thrift, and the kind of Lutheran stubbornness that refuses to lie down even when lying down would be the reasonable choice. So she did not lie down. She sat on the trunk and waited to see what the road would send her. What the road sent her was a wagon coming up out of the low country with 2 boys on the bench and a man behind them who looked like he had not slept properly in a year. The boys were maybe 8 and 11, both barefoot, both watching her with the wary interest of animals who had learned that strangers were mostly a disappointment. The man drew the team up level with her and said nothing for a long moment. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now mostly weather. "Trouble?" he finally asked. "An axle," Hannah said, "and a letter that turned out to be a grave." He looked at her trunk. He looked at the road behind her. He looked at his 2 boys, who were still watching her the way they might have watched a coyote that had wandered too close to the porch. "Where were you bound?" "Elkhorn Bend. To teach. The schoolmaster who hired me is dead. Reverend Hollister," the man said, and it was not a question. "Yes. Fever took him in June." She nodded, because there was nothing to add to that. The man was quiet a while. Then he said, "I can take you into town. There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Ashby. She might let you stay a night on credit if I speak for you." "I don't need credit," Hannah said. "I need work." The older boy on the bench snorted, and his father reached back without looking and cuffed the top of his head, not hard, just enough to remind him that manners were still expected even at the edge of nowhere. The boy went red and looked at his knees. Hannah stood up. She was not a small woman. She was tall and broad through the shoulders, the way farm-raised German women were often built, and she had been called plain often enough by relatives in St. Louis that she had stopped hearing it. She looked the man in the eye, which he did not seem to have expected. "I can cook for your men," she said. She had meant the words as an offer, plain and practical. The country was full of ranches and mining camps and homesteads that needed a hand in a kitchen, and she had cooked for 40 boarders in her father's house since she was 14. She could feed 30 men on a side of beef and a sack of flour and have them ask for seconds. It was the one thing in her life she had never doubted. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, and what he said next she would remember for the rest of her life. "My sons need more than meals." She did not know what to say to that. The older boy was still staring at his knees. The younger one, the 8-year-old, had shifted closer to his brother on the bench, and Hannah saw for the first time that his left hand was wrapped in a rag that had gone brown at the edges. The man saw her looking. "Ephraim burned it on the stove 3 weeks back. Their mother would have known what to do. I put lard on it and prayed." "Lard was wrong," Hannah said, before she had decided to speak. "It seals the heat in. You want it clean and open to the air. Honey if you have it, or a poultice of yarrow." The man's eyes changed, just slightly. Not warm, just attentive, the way a man's eyes change when he has been listening to fools for a long time and has suddenly heard something that is not foolish. "Get in," he said. She got in. He helped her lift the trunk into the wagon bed with the calm strength of a man who had lifted many heavier things in his life, and then he clicked his tongue at the team, and they moved off down the road toward Elkhorn Bend. The boys did not speak. Neither did the man. Hannah sat on her trunk in the wagon bed and watched the country roll past, sagebrush and red dirt, and the far blue line of mountains that she had not yet learned to name, and tried to understand what had just happened to her life. His name was Josiah Rennick. She learned it from Mrs. Ashby that night over a bowl of thin stew, along with a good deal else that Mrs. Ashby seemed eager to unburden herself of. Rennick ran 1,200 acres of grazing land 8 miles south of town. His wife, Amelia, had died the previous fall of a wasting sickness that no one could name. He had 2 sons, Caleb, the elder, who had gone silent for a full month after his mother's burial and had only recently begun speaking again, and Ephraim, the little one, who cried in his sleep and would not eat meat. Rennick himself had lost 40 pounds since October and had turned away 3 women the town had tried to introduce him to, on the grounds that he was not looking for a wife and did not intend to become the kind of man who was. Then why did he ask me to come out and see about the boys? Hannah asked, because after they'd rolled into town, Rennick had said only that if she wanted honest work, he could offer her a month's trial, keeping his house and looking after his sons, at $8 a month and a room of her own, and that she could give her answer in the morning. Mrs. Ashby looked at her over the rim of a tin cup. Because you told him lard was wrong. Hannah sat with that. She sat with it a long time after the lamp was out and the boarding house had gone quiet and the coyotes had started up their high, thin conversation out beyond the corrals. She was 29, unmarried, and stranded in a town where she knew no one. She had $8 a month on offer from a widower she did not know, in a house with 2 grieving children she did not know, and every practical bone in her body told her the arrangement would be misread by every gossiping tongue in Elkhorn Bend within a week. And still, when she thought of the little boy with the brown-edged rag around his hand, something in her chest set itself down and would not be moved. She sent word in the morning. She would come. Now, if you've ever stood at a crossroads in your own life, a moment where the sensible choice and the true choice were pointing in different directions, and you knew that whichever one you picked would decide the rest of your years, I'd like you to hold that memory a moment, because Hannah Vogel was standing in exactly that place, and I suspect a good many of you listening tonight know the weight of it. Tell me later, if you like, where you were standing when your own road split. I'd like to hear. The Rennick house sat in a fold of land where 2 dry creeks met, a low log house with a sod roof and a plank addition that had been built quickly and never quite finished. The kitchen faced east and caught the morning sun. The pantry was nearly empty. The stove had not been properly blacked in a year. There were 3 shirts of Josiah's on the back of a chair, unwashed, and a child's stocking on the floor beside them that had been there long enough for the mice to have investigated it. Hannah put down her trunk in the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, took off her traveling coat, tied on the apron that had been her mother's, and began. She did not begin with the boys. That was the first thing she understood. You did not walk up to a grieving animal and put your hand on its face. You put food in a bowl and set it down and moved away and let the animal come to the food when it was ready. So she began with the kitchen. By the end of the first day, the stove was black and the flour was sifted and there was bread rising under a cloth on the windowsill. By the end of the first week, Ephraim's burn had scabbed clean and pink under a poultice she changed twice a day, and Caleb had eaten 3 helpings of a chicken and dumpling stew that had, according to his father's quiet remark, been the first thing he had asked for seconds of since his mother had died. By the end of the first month, the boys had begun to trail her the way ducklings trail a mother across a pond. Not close, not touching, but always within sight. Caleb had begun bringing her small stones he found in the creek. Ephraim had begun leaning against her hip when she stood at the stove. Neither of them called her anything yet. She did not push. Josiah Rennick paid her $8 in silver at the end of the first month, laid on the kitchen table without a word, and asked if she would stay for another. She said she would. Neither of them looked at the other when they said it. The town, of course, had opinions. She heard the first of them at the general store, where a woman named Mrs. Delph, whom she had never met, took a long, slow look at her over a bolt of calico and said, loud enough to carry, that it was a strange thing indeed for a widower with 2 sons to bring a strange woman into his house before his wife had been a full year in the ground. Hannah paid for her needles and thread and walked out without answering. She had grown up in a boarding house full of men and had learned early that answering was often what a woman like Mrs. Delph was waiting for. The second opinion came from the pulpit 2 Sundays later, delivered by the new Methodist preacher, a young man from Ohio, who spoke about the sanctity of the household and the dangers of arrangements that gave the appearance of impropriety. He did not name her. He did not need to. Hannah sat in the third pew with Caleb on one side and Ephraim on the other, and she felt Ephraim's small hand slide into hers and grip hard, because he was old enough to understand that someone was being talked about and young enough to be frightened by it. She did not go up for the closing hymn. She walked the boys home in silence, and when Josiah came in from the barn that evening, she told him plain what had been said. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he set down his coffee cup and looked at her across the kitchen table for a long time. "Do you want to go back to St. Louis?" he asked. "No," she said. "I want to stay, but I want to stay honest." He nodded slowly. "Then we do this proper." That was all he said, and she did not press him to say more, because she had learned that Josiah Rennick's words were like coins he had counted twice before he spent them. She went to bed that night, not knowing what proper meant to him, and lay awake a long time, trying not to hope for one particular thing over another. The trouble that came, when it came, did not come from the church. It came in the form of a man on a black horse who rode up the wagon track one afternoon in late September with a leather satchel across his saddle and a look in his eye that Hannah recognized before he had spoken a word. She had seen that look on lawyers in St. Louis who had come to her father's house after his death carrying papers full of numbers that always, somehow, ended in her family losing something. The man introduced himself as Mr. Ballard of Denver, representing the interests of the late Amelia Rennick's brother, one Nathaniel Crane, who had it on legal authority that the Rennick property, having been purchased with funds provided in part by the Crane family estate before the marriage, ought properly to revert in trust to the surviving Crane heirs, being himself, in the absence of Amelia. Mr. Ballard said all of this in one long, clean sentence, the way a man says a thing he has said many times before, and when he was finished he produced a folded paper from his satchel and held it out to Josiah. Josiah did not take the paper. He looked at it. Then he looked at Ballard. "The land's mine," he said. "Been mine 10 years. I have the deed." "The deed is not in dispute," Ballard said pleasantly. "The source of the purchase funds is. My client is prepared to be reasonable. He is prepared to offer you a settlement of $2,000 in exchange for a clean transfer, and to allow you a period of 6 months to remove yourself and your children from the property. Given the circumstances," and here his eyes flicked, briefly and unmistakably, toward Hannah on the porch, "I would consider that a generous accommodation." Hannah felt the shape of the whole thing then, all at once. She understood that Nathaniel Crane had not simply appeared. Someone in Elkhorn Bend had written to him. Someone had told him about the widower with the 2 boys and the woman who had moved into the house before the year was out, and someone had put it in language that had made a distant, grieving brother reach for a lawyer. Josiah took the paper. He did not open it. He folded it once more, put it in his shirt pocket, and told Mr. Ballard that he would send his answer within the week. Ballard tipped his hat, mounted his black horse, and rode back the way he had come. Josiah stood on the porch a long time after the horse was gone. Hannah stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Finally he said, quiet, "Amelia's father lent us $400 toward the down payment. 12 years ago. I paid it back inside 2 winters. I have the receipt. I have the letter. I have every scrap of paper from that transaction in a tin in the pantry." "Then we find it," Hannah said. "It won't be about the money," Josiah said. Nathaniel never cared about the money. He cared about his sister marrying below her people. He wrote her 3 letters a year for a decade telling her so. When she died, he stopped writing. This, and he touched his shirt pocket, isn't about the $400. This is about him deciding my boys ought to be raised in Denver by their aunt, in a proper house, by proper people. Hannah understood then, fully, what she was standing inside of. The lawyer was not the danger. The lawyer was the paper the danger had sent ahead of itself. The danger was a man in Denver who believed that a rancher who had let a strange woman into his house had proved himself unfit to raise the Crane blood in his children. They found the tin that night. They found the receipt and the letter and the canceled bank draft, all of them yellowed and dry but perfectly legible, and they laid them out on the kitchen table under the lamp while the boys slept in the loft above them. Hannah read the letter aloud, in Amelia's own handwriting, thanking her father for the loan and confirming its repayment in full by the spring of the 2nd year. Josiah listened with his head bent. "That'll settle the deed," he said. "That won't settle the boys." "Then we settle the boys another way," Hannah said. She had not decided the thing until she said it. But the moment it was out of her mouth, she knew it had been decided a long time before, somewhere below the level where she had been keeping track. He looked up at her. "Marry me," she said. It came out plainer than she had meant it to. "Not because we love each other. We might, in time. I don't know. Marry me because a married woman in this house is not a scandal. A married woman in this house is a mother. And a mother in this house is a wall Nathaniel Crane cannot walk through." Josiah Rennick looked at her across the yellowed papers, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw his face change all the way through. Not surprise. Not gratitude. Something older and more tired than either of those. Something that had been waiting. "I won't ask you to do that," he said. "You didn't," she said. "I did." They sat with it a long while. The lamp guttered. From the loft, one of the boys turned over in his sleep and murmured something that was almost a word. "There's a thing you should know first," Josiah said. His voice had gone very low. "Amelia didn't die of a wasting sickness. That's what we tell the town. She died of something in her mind that came on after Ephraim was born and never lifted. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking to the boys. She stopped, at the end, wanting to be here. I found her one morning down by the creek. There was no sickness in her body. There was only that she had walked out into the water in her night dress in November and lain down." He said it all in one breath, and when he was done, he did not look at Hannah. "Nathaniel doesn't know that," he said. "If he knew that, he would have been here inside a month, with a judge and a wagon. He thinks it was fever, because that's what the death certificate said, because the doctor in Elkhorn Bend was a friend, and he wrote what I asked him to write. So when I tell you that this isn't about a deed, and it isn't even really about my boys, I want you to know what I mean. It's about a man in Denver who blames me for a thing I could not stop, and who will spend every dollar he has to prove I am not fit to keep what she and I made." Hannah was quiet a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand flat over his. "Then he will spend it," she said, "and he will lose." They were married 11 days later in the small Lutheran church a half-day's ride north of Elkhorn Bend, by a pastor who had known Josiah's father and who asked no questions he did not need answers to. The boys stood with them. Caleb held the ring. Ephraim held Hannah's hand the entire way through the service and did not let go until the pastor said amen. There were 4 other people in the church. Mrs. Ashby was one of them. She had brought a bouquet of late asters wrapped in brown paper, and she kissed Hannah on both cheeks afterward and told her, quietly, that she had known from the first night in the boarding house how it would go. Nathaniel Crane arrived in Elkhorn Bend 2 weeks after that. With Mr. Ballard and a second lawyer and a district judge from Denver, he had brought at his own considerable expense. He rode out to the Rennick place on a Tuesday morning, dismounted in the yard, and demanded to speak to Josiah. He was met, on the porch, by Mrs. Hannah Rennick, in a clean gray dress, with Ephraim on her hip and Caleb standing at her side. She invited him in for coffee in a voice so calm and civil that the judge, later, would say it had been the most disarming thing he had witnessed in 20 years on the bench. They spread the papers on the kitchen table. The receipt, the letter, the canceled draft, the marriage certificate, which Hannah had thought, at the last moment, to bring down from the shelf. The judge read them all, one by one, in silence. Nathaniel Crane sat across the table from Hannah and did not look at the papers. He looked at her. "You will not raise my sister's children," he said at last, low. "I already am," Hannah said. She said it without heat. She said it the way a person states the weather. "And they are not your sister's children anymore, Mr. Crane." She left them. "I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it is true, and because you have come 900 miles to argue with the truth. They are Josiah's children, and now they are mine." Something in Nathaniel Crane's face broke, very quietly, in a way Hannah understood was not going to be visible to anyone else in the room. He had come to fight a scandal. He had come expecting a woman who would flinch. He had found, instead, a woman who had cooked breakfast for his sister's sons that morning and would cook it for them again tomorrow. And the fight went out of him not because she had beaten him, but because she had shown him, without meaning to, exactly what he had lost. The judge ruled from the table. The deed was clean. The marriage was legal. The children were where they belonged. Mr. Ballard collected his papers. Nathaniel Crane stood, put on his hat, and walked out to his horse without speaking again. Before he mounted, he stopped, and turned, and looked back at the porch where Caleb was now standing with his hand in Hannah's. "Tell them," he said, to no one in particular. that their uncle in Denver would like to write to them, if they will let him. They will let you, Hannah said. He nodded once and rode away, and she never saw him again in her life. Though letters came at Christmas for many years, addressed in a careful hand to Master Caleb and Master Ephraim Rennick, and containing, always, a $5 note folded inside a card. The winter that followed was the coldest Elkhorn Bend had seen in a decade. Snow came down through October and did not lift until April. Ephraim's burn healed to a pale seam across the back of his hand that he would carry the rest of his life. Caleb grew 4 inches and began to laugh again, loud and startling, the way boys laugh when they have remembered how. Josiah Rennick, who had come home one evening in December to find his wife and both his sons asleep together in a heap in front of the kitchen stove, stood in the doorway a long moment looking at them, and then went out into the yard and stood under the cold stars, and cried for the first time since the November his first wife had walked into the water. He came back inside. He put more wood on the fire. He did not wake them. Hannah Rennick lived on that land for 41 years. She buried Josiah in the spring of her 63rd year and stayed on with Ephraim and his wife, who by then had 3 daughters of their own, one of whom Hannah had helped bring into the world in the same bedroom where Amelia had once lain refusing to eat. Caleb had gone to Denver as a young man and become, of all things, a lawyer, and had written his mother every week of his adult life, and every letter began with the words "Dear Ma," which was the only name he had ever called her from the summer he turned 12. She used to say, in her old age, when the neighbors' grown daughters came to sit with her on the porch, and ask her how it was that a woman could walk into a house full of strangers' grief and make herself a home there, that a person was not measured by what they inherited, but by what they were willing to stand between. She said it only once to each of them. She was not a woman who repeated herself. They remembered it anyway. So there it is, the story of Hannah Vogel, who came west to teach for a dead man and ended up teaching 2 living boys what a mother could be. If it warmed you tonight, wherever you're listening from, whether the kettle's on or the light's low, I hope you'll stay a while with us here. There are more stories like this one waiting, and I'd like to tell them to you.